Hi everyone, this is Blake Anderson. I'm a registered social worker and therapist here in Toronto, Ontario. In this brief video, I'm going to be covering Bowen family therapy, particularly understanding it from what's considered an integral theory. That's an approach by Ken Wilber, and he talks about the 4 quadrants. So it's understanding the family as an emotional unit. And so I'm going to be covering Bowen family therapy and how it's important consideration when understanding narcissistic abuse recovery or being on the receiving end of emotionally immature parents. So in this video, I'll be covering Bowen family therapy and giving an introduction to his approach and how it's understood from a systems perspective. So stay tuned. All right, so in this module, I'm going to talk about the quadrants from the lower right and then the lower left. I'm going to talk first about Bowen family theory. Looks primarily from the lower right quadrant. That is understanding the family dynamic and the collective exterior systems and structures of the family. Then there's also the lower left, which is the family system from the interior, the collective interior. So it's the shared culture, values, and norms within the family, which will be covered. And then I have already went through the upper left, and so that's understanding the individual and how they experience it in terms of being in that relationship with a narcissist or emotionally immature person. But in this next quadrant, it's going to be talking more about the family dynamic as it relates to coping and managing with a narcissist or a codependent parent or perhaps a sibling in your family. But this is just going to understand it from a systems perspective using Ken Wilber's integral model. Bowen family system theory understands the family as an emotional unit. Bowen has 8 central principles to his theory, and I'm not going to go into all of them for just the length of this module. But I am going to emphasize 3 or 4 central ways in which Bowen can be applied to dysfunctional family systems and how he speaks about this topic in terms of a systems perspective. Bowen family system theory was designed from a collective exterior developmental lens by the psychiatrist Murray Bowen. He mentions the 8 concepts in his theory. Viewing the family as an emotional unit where members are deeply interconnected, influencing behaviors across generations is also emphasized. The key concepts in the 8 concepts include the notion of differentiation of self, triangles, and the family projection process. And so in terms of the differentiation of self, that's very much core to Bowen's system theory. Differentiation of self is defined as the ability to separate one's intellectual and emotional functioning from the family's emotional system. Highly differentiated individuals can maintain their sense of values and beliefs while remaining emotionally connected and fostering healthy relationships. Poor differentiation leads to emotional fusion, where family members react automatically to each other's emotions and increasing anxiety and dysfunction. And he measures this on a scale from 0 to 100, and he says the average person falls between 20 to 40 in terms of being differentiated, where a mid-range level of differentiated to be in some ways healthy. He believed that a lot of people were very much emotionally fused in their family dynamic. And another concept in his theory is the notion of triangles. And so this is central to his theory in terms of understanding the makeup of the family. And again, this is taking an exterior systems perspective, so understanding the notion of triangles. And so he believed that the nature of all relationships has a level of triangles in it, in the sense that when you're speaking with another person, there's typically another. And so he says that these are the basic units of an emotional system involving 3 people, where anxiety between 2 is managed by involving a third. So it's interesting that he mentions the notion of anxiety, and this comes central to his theory as well. So triangles is a way that the anxiety gets managed within the family unit. And so you can think about a typical example of 2 two parents and having maybe one child where the two parents, let's say they're stressed from work or from other stresses in their life, and perhaps they are unconscious or they're not fully differentiating themselves, and so they tend to offload their anxiety onto the child. And this can be, there are many different types of triangles. You could have perhaps a wife who's aligned maybe with their mom, and that creates some form of triangle in the relationship with the husband perhaps. And so these are different ways to analyze and look at the family from a structural perspective, from an exterior perspective. And so triangles can stabilize relationships, but they become chronic and dysfunctional in high anxiety families, often forming around roles like the scapegoat. And so that's examples again of the parent and the child in conflict might draw in into the scapegoat and like another sibling as well, maybe to reduce the tension, but this can perpetuate unhealthy dynamics. So there's also the notion of triangulation, and there is this notion that perhaps you have one parent pulling in another sibling, and there could be being bullying or making fun of the one child as a form of a triangle. So just to kind of look at maybe your situation in your life, think about how this maybe formed in your relationships early on in terms of your growing up. So you could also write on a piece of paper or on the computer these different triangles that occurred and kind of look at them. And usually some people might do like a family tree, right? So these are just ways to externalize the family from an exterior perspective, from a systems perspective. And I think it's helpful sometimes to at least have that there is some family constellations work and other approaches where you do a genogram or a family tree, and then you kind of make some drawings. And I'll leave in the description a link to how you can do this. And it's just simply, if someone gets divorced, there might be a cross in the line, but you're just mapping out your family and maybe the grandparents and perhaps even the great-grandparents, and you're seeing if there's any connections. You could also do some research into, was there mental health in the family or trauma to some degree? It could be significant events like a war, and sometimes people already know this, so it's not something maybe that you're not aware of. In this lesson, I'm going to walk through aspects of Bowen family system theory in terms of emotional cutoff, the projection identification process, and the multi-generational transmission process. These make up part of the 8 concepts of Bowen family therapy. They're very helpful in getting further insight from a systems perspective using integral theory and understanding the dysfunctional family dynamic. Emotional cutoff means when a family member distances themselves emotionally or physically to avoid unresolved issues, often leading to strained relationships. Bowen observed that this can happen in families leading to certain distances, either physically or emotionally, due to unresolved issues. In dysfunctional families with emotionally immature parents, they may cut off from their own family history, impacting their ability to connect with their children, creating distance and unresolved conflicts. As mentioned earlier, there's the narcissistic abuse cycle. Perhaps one has been through that cycle many times, or they've grown frustrated with their emotionally immature or narcissistic parents. Perhaps they've stood up for themselves in a conflict and got quite angry, leading to an emotional cutoff. This could be notion of going no contact or stonewalling. It can be either the parents themselves that are stonewalling or the adult child of the emotionally immature parent. This is just one way to consider an emotional cutoff and helps define from a Bowen family systems perspective what could be occurring in a family. He also has the concept of multi-generational transmission process. This term refers to how emotional patterns like anxiety or immaturity are passed down through generations, leading to low differentiation and more intense transmission. The less that the family is differentiated, the more likely that this transmission will be more intense. Coming from a dysfunctional family or emotionally immature family with maybe 1 or 2 narcissists. Like I said earlier, narcissism or emotional maturity can exist on a spectrum, but in more extreme situations, it can be quite harmful. It could be 2 narcissistic parents and They could be splitting in terms of having the kids be assigned roles, even if it's subconscious or unconscious. And it can lead to almost like a cult-like dynamic in terms of the children serving the parents' needs, and there be no feedback and no way in which there's usually emotional discussions happening, so everything is thrown under the rug. And so that's the understanding of multi-generational transmission, so that throughout generations this can occur, especially in families that lack differentiation. Dysfunctional family, emotionally immature parents shaped by their own upbringing pass on poor emotional regulations to their children, which continues the cycle. Often in dynamics I've observed or been part of in terms of working with my clients, there can be certain alliances happen in the family. Perhaps it could be the oldest child and either one or two of the parents. It's almost like Star Wars, where there's Luke and Darth Vader. You can see Darth Vader challenging Luke to become part of the dark side, and Luke is resisting. You could take an analysis from a family systems perspective with that dynamic. There could be an unconscious or unhealthy lack of differentiation being passed down, let's say from a father to a son, and if that doesn't get broken or there's no healthy differentiation in the family, it will continue to pass and the karma or the transmission will continue to occur. This is why it can be quite difficult for people who have been scapegoated, have started to observe this in their families. There really can be a solid lack of differentiation and very much a resistance to this transmission that's come through the generations, maybe due to trauma or just the notion of a lack of differentiation. And the final concept I wanted to mention using Bowen is the notion of projection, the projection process. In psychology, I think a lot of us understand the notion of projection. A lot of people are projecting, particularly if you're emotionally immature and narcissistic. This could happen in the family. That's what Bowen observed. He talked about parents projecting their anxieties or unresolved issues onto a child, making them the focus of family problems, often through triangulation. So in dysfunctional family dynamics, emotionally mature parents might project their insecurities onto a child, expecting them to meet unmet needs and creating roles like the scapegoat. A parent feeling inadequate might constantly criticize a child's performance, making the child feel responsible for their parent's unhappiness. When I worked in child welfare, there often would be situations where a family would want us to fix their child. Certainly there are situations where behavioral issues are not fully to do with the parents. Often when treating a 5-year-old or a young child, you start to see how the family dynamic can also be causing the problem in terms of the child's behavior. This could be the notion of triangulation or triangles. It's not to blame the parents, but to see it from a family systems perspective. And that's why Bowen is very helpful, as it understands this projection process. You can see more extreme examples, such as a mom keeping their child home from school because they're always sick. These 3 concepts I wanted to cover are core to understanding dysfunctional family dynamics. We went over triangles, emotional cutoffs, the multi-generational transmission process, and the projection process of the family. Understanding these concepts can help you get more insight into your own family dynamic, either presently or in the past in terms of your childhood. I would encourage you to do some journaling, consider how did this process show up for me, and is there a current emotional cutoff? Maybe map this in terms of that genogram as in the earlier practice we did. Think about your family history and how intergenerational trauma or transmission can occur. It might be mapping out major events, mental health in the family, narcissism or emotional immaturity. In the next video, I'll go through some criticisms or different ways to consider Bowen. It's not the only view on looking at the family and the system perspective, but I want to offer more insights into other approaches when working with family dynamics. So in this lesson, I want to go over some criticisms or different ways to think about the strengths and limitations of Bowen family therapy, and introduce you to family constellations and other approaches to consider when thinking about the family system. Bowen family therapy talks about the family as an emotional unit and understands that each family member's behavior affects the whole. As mentioned, it focuses on differentiation of self, triangles, the multi-generational transmission process. It has 8 main concepts when understanding the approach. It's considered more analytical and structural, whereas family constellation is more to do with direct experience and less analytical. And some criticism of Bowen's family therapy is that it can be perhaps too abstract or theoretical and making it hard for clients to engage. It may not address immediate emotional needs, focusing more on long-term processes. And it requires a certain amount of commitment because it's not something that you can do very quick or it's necessarily solution orientated. So these are just things to think about when considering Bowen family therapy. But I would say that getting an overview of your family and understanding some basics, it has a lot of strengths, particularly using the genogram, the notion of triangles, and other processes that occur in the family. Family constellation is a different approach, and this is a modality or a method that I've come across in my own practice. It's something I use when working with clients and families. The approach was created and developed by Burke Hellinger. So he integrated existential feminology, family systems therapy, and indigenous wisdom, particularly from the Zulu tribe in South Africa, which I believe he's a priest. So he observed this tribe in South Africa, and from that he uses, again, feminology, which is a type of philosophy in terms of it's primarily from Husserl. So Husserl focuses on direct experience and intuition, avoiding interpretation. There's a whole school of thought with this philosophy, but it's just to note that for Hellinger, it's more about direct experience and intuition and avoiding overanalyzing or making it overly analytical. He also has the Zulu influences mentioned. Hellinger observed and emphasized honoring ancestors and interconnectionness, and this was all things he observed in these tribes and their rituals and how they very much honored their past and lineage. And so I think it's just something to think about when thinking about your family, thinking about how there can be these hidden loyalties. So he also talks about systematic engagement of the family. So it's about first viewing the family as a system, but with hidden loyalties, and unresolved issues can be affecting current dynamics.